So just a quick disclaimer before we jump into it. I recorded this video the other day. When I went back, I noticed I kept talking about the V30, V60, and V90. That has to do with the video write speed of the cards. But the interesting thing is, a lot of people will say that, oh, well, there's not really much of a difference between a V30 and a V90 when it comes to photo taking. We're going to see the difference it makes because all three of these cards are all class 10. They're all a 3 UHS speed class, but one's a V30, one's a V60, and one's a V90, along with my CF Express that we use. And it's going to show you the difference between how fast it can write onto the card because that class does matter when it comes to photos. And I'm going to link the ProGrade website down below so that way you can actually see what they're talking about and they explain everything with how those classes work. And if you're doing still photography, you may not need a higher write speed. You might be okay buying V30s because they're super cheap. But I just wanted to throw that out there just so that way it's aware before anybody jumped below and said anything about it.
What's going on, y'all? So today let's talk about SD cards and how they affect your camera. Because let's be honest, there are a lot of different SD cards out there. And you can see like this case is older than how long Type A have existed because these are relatively newer because Sony wanted to invent them apparently for their cameras because they couldn't use Type B like everybody else. They had to be fancy. So let's talk about it. Let's jump into the different types of SD cards and maybe when you should use them and when you shouldn't use them. I know most of you are thinking like you just buy the big SD card and throw it in your camera. Well, you can also buy the micro SD card and use an adapter and use it in your camera as well. And that's going to be great for people that are on a budget. But there are also some problems when you do something like this, right? Because you throw it in that adapter and it works great, right? Now I can throw it in my camera and it's going to work. I can take video, I can take photos, and guess what? This thing's going to cost me like 25 bucks and it's going to be 128 gigs versus if I buy this one's going to be like double that price for the same exact thing. So why wouldn't I just buy these? Well, you've come to the right place if that's your question. So micro SD cards are very convenient and they're very cheap. You can buy something like this for half the price that you can buy something like this that's basically the same thing. They're both 128 gigs and a 30V. So why would you not just buy this versus this? Well, the reason I would say to not buy this, if it's for your big camera, now you use these in your drone and your cell phone, your Pocket 3, your GoPro, any of those small action cameras, you're definitely gonna be buying one of these. But the reason you wouldn't want to use this on your big camera is because the adapter. The adapter is great because if you want to plug it into your computer, it just slides in just like that and you just, bam, now you basically have a normal sized SD card. But the reason you wouldn't want to use it because of the contact points on the adapter. So you can use these, no issues using them. You just run the risk of if it's writing onto this card through the adapter, it's got to write through the adapter onto this card. Versus if you have a card plugged in, it'll write directly onto the card, if that makes sense. So there's these contact points, it's got to go through here, and then the adapter in here, and it's got to write onto these contact points and into the card. So it's got to go through this first and then transfer it onto the micro SD card. Versus if you're using a normal SD card, it goes straight onto the card versus having to go through that extra contact point. So you run the risk of possibly having some issues with that. Can you use these? Yes. Is it wise? Maybe not, especially if you're doing something like weddings or anything like that. So it'd be better off buying a normal SD card versus using the micros in your camera. Now, if you're somebody who is on a budget and you're not doing paid work, you could definitely do this, but like anything, it's gonna write slower. But what do I mean by write slower? So written onto SD cards, you're gonna see things that say like V30, V60, V90. And that's gonna be basically how the write speed is on it, right? V30 is lower, so it's gonna have a slower write speed. So like this one right here, this SanDisk one, this is a V30 with a 200 megabit per second write speed versus this Lexar one, which is a V60 that's 250 megabits per second. And now that does not sound like a lot, right? That's a 50 megabit difference. But when it comes to photography and if you're shooting like high burst, that is a big deal. And then you're gonna have something like this. This is a V90 and it's gonna write at about 300 megabits a second. And then when we get out of the SD cards, you have like a Type A, which this one runs at 900 megabits a second when it's writing. I don't have a Type B because I have no need for it because I shoot on the A7 IV. With those different levels, that's gonna be how fast your camera writes to the card. This is 900 megabits a second. This is 200 megabits a second. And yes, for photos, that's a big deal, but also when you're doing video, right? So if you're doing 4K, 60 frames a second, 120 frames a second, whatever it might be, you're probably gonna need something more like this than this, because sometimes these cameras are not able to write onto this just because of how slow this card is when it's getting memory downloaded onto it. And the thing people don't tell you about write speeds, this is 300 going from the camera onto the card, but this is also 300 going from the card onto your computer, and this is 200 going from the card onto your computer. So it's also going to save you time in the long run. Now, if that's out of your budget, don't worry about it. Get what you can. But I'm just throwing that out there. So if this 900 megabit one, if I throw this into my computer, it's going to download a lot faster than this 200 megabit one. So if you're somebody that's impatient like me, the 900 megabit one, it's going to download a lot faster for you. So that's a general overview of these different cards and how the write speeds work and how the class works. So you're going to see that if you see a V30, a V60, a V90, you're going to know, okay, the V90s may be where I want to go because I'm shooting sports, versus the V30, your camera's going to buffer a lot more. And what do I mean by buffer? Well, let me show you. So just a quick side note, if you plan on doing the video side of things, you may have to upgrade anyway, because some V30 cards aren't going to be able to get 60 frames a second on it, and your camera is just not going to allow that to happen. I've heard that happening with some friends that shoot with like the Canon R5 and things like that. So just be aware of that. So you may have to upgrade your card if you're going to start doing a lot more video work than photography work, or you're going to be in the middle about things. It may be better to just go ahead and buy those V90s or those CF Expresses. So just a couple things to note. This camera's 10 frames a second, but I'm also shooting uncompressed RAW because I love having all that data so I can manipulate it any way I want. So if you're using JPEG, your results may vary. When you're doing something like this, just for the sole fact those files aren't as high, right? You're talking like an 8 megabyte file versus a 70 megabyte file for uncompressed RAW coming out of this camera. So now that I have that out of the way, let's jump into it and see the comparisons. So let's test the micro SD card, and you can see the number in the top left corner, it just drops drastically. So that's 10 frames a second, really quick, but you see the buffering? That's because it's trying to load all those photos you just took onto the camera. So it's gonna take just a little more time. So you can use micro SD cards in the adapter. It's a viable option. It just might not be the best with wildlife or anything that's moving, just because of the fact that it's going to take a minute to buffer. So it's not going to be able to capture those images as fast. So this card is essentially the same exact one. It's a V30, but it's just the larger format, right? It's an actual SD card versus the micro. You're going to see virtually no difference between the write speed of this versus the write speed of the micro SD card. I just wanted to show them both to show you that you could use the micro SD card if you wanted to, but you can see how long it's taken with the buffering on this one. And then next is the V60. This is where you're going to notice the difference. So when we start taking these images, you're going to see everything's about the same, but when it starts to write onto the card and take these photos right here, you can see how there's less buffering because of that faster write speed of it being a V60. Now we're on to the V90. The V90, you're going to see some buffering, but this is going to be virtually barely noticeable. You can see the number drop, and then right here, we're about to see the buffering. And you can see there's buffering, but when we compare it to the V60 or to the V30, it's a lot better than that. You're not going to narrowly miss as many shots because of the buffering. You can see how fast that number is just dropping at the top, right? That virtually took no time. And then the CF Express. The cool thing about a CF Express is how fast they write. And basically what we're going to see here is this number is going to drop drastically. See how fast it is? It's just going to keep going. Look at that. There is no buffering. No buffering. You were waiting for the buffering. We don't have buffering on this one. You see how nice it is to have a CF Express. So if your camera takes it and you're doing something like wildlife or sports, the CF Express is definitely going to be the way to go. So the difference between the V30 and the CF Express definitely was very noticeable, but maybe between the V30 and the V90, it wasn't that big of a deal for some of y'all. So y'all let me know what you think. I appreciate you coming along with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.